types of issues. Climate change is one of these types of issues. We have some other examples here on the podium that we've spoken about. But it's when issues are not only really important, you know, that we want to be able to be talking about them, but they're also very controversial. They also generate a lot of heat. People get emotional. They're very committed to positions. They've gotten politicized potentially. There's all sorts of it's very difficult in a way to talk even neutrally, as we were suggesting this morning, to say, well, we need to talk carefully and be very careful about how we speak about these things. These are hard issues to talk carefully about. So how do we best do that? Just example from my own research, I do some studies on climate change, and I've had students come back from the field where they were interviewing subjects, and the very last question of the protocol was something about, you know, so have you seen, or do you think climate is changing? Something like that, very neutral, what I thought was a very neutral question. And they lit into the student, like, oh my gosh, you guys are here, you're under false pretenses, you're perpetrating this hoax, you know, getting very emotional, it was a very strong reaction. I've also heard of other researchers being threatened because they sent out a survey about climate change to local residents here in Boulder County. So again, these things are, it hits us as researchers as well as just sort of a general hypothetical issue. So here in this panel today, and Max is going to introduce each person, but I just wanted to say how we're framing this panel. These three speakers are experts in a particular area, and they've had to engage controversial topics from their position of expertise. And they each have a different role in doing that, and they'll speak about how they engage these topics as experts. And we sort of have a continuum, or I want to say a different position of the expert in these different dialogues as we go along. One person is a government scientist coming and trying to talk as an expert about a particular technology to a community that might be kind of skeptical or maybe even hostile to it. Another person's a professor talking about evolution in their classroom and how do you do that. Another person actually talks about how you run and actually runs public participation groups to sort of try to think of different ways to engage the public over controversial topics. So each of them are going to speak from a very personal experience position of how they've navigated these controversies, how they've spoken about them, what the pros and cons are of being in their particular position of expertise. You know, they're in the classroom trying to speak to people, they've been flown in for a day as an expert, how that goes, and so on. And so we'll be hearing from each of them, and then at the end, we're going to have an open dialogue with you all asking questions and so on. So I hope that you today from the panel get some sense of what the range of options are for communicating about these issues and some maybe good hints of pros and cons and how to do that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Max to introduce our speakers particularly.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. So I'm excited that we were able to get great people in the room here for this panel. I also happen to know each of you personally, and I'm happy to call you friends as well as colleagues, but I'll refrain from any sorts of personal anecdotes as I introduce each of you. I think maybe the best way to just give brief introductions and then turn it over to them for 15 minutes each is just to bookend maybe who they are by some of these notions of expertise. So with current affiliation, and then finish with some of the credentials, and then in between what they're studying, and perhaps in addition something interesting that I find about their professional work. So our first speaker will be Suzanne Tegen, who's an energy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Lab since 2002. She's part of the Market and Policy Impact Analysis group there. Second, she focuses on renewable energy policy, so ranging from wind, solar, marine hydrokinetic, and other technologies, focuses on economic and environmental impacts from energy production as well as wind power, social acceptance, and public involvement. Quite a number of lively topics. Third, she was, before this position, an environmental specialist with the U.S. Antarctic program at McMurdo Station in the 1990s. Also, after that time, was part of the Center for Resource Solutions in San Francisco. So her expertise, fruit plate of credentials include a PhD in environmental studies, focusing on environmental policy, and then also her first degree from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Second, we're going to hear from Becca Safran, who's an assistant professor in ecology and evolutionary biology here at CU Boulder. Her work focuses on causes and consequences of biodiversity at multiple scales, interactions between the physiology and the phenology or phenotypes of songbird behavior and other charismatic megafauna and other flora and fauna, understanding the evolutionary differences therein. So she teaches the interesting bit that I think professionally, she teaches this great course here on campus that I hope you're familiar with. If you're not, check it out. It's a climate and film course she's been teaching now in her 4th year, is that right?
That's right.
And in addition, the add-on is that she's embarking on a great NSF career grant with all kinds of fantastic research projects going. Her final accoutrement is the PhD at Cornell University. And third, we'll hear from Jason Delborne, who's an assistant professor in liberal arts and in international studies at the Colorado School of Mines. He's also an affiliate member at Arizona State in the Consortium on Science, Policy, and Outcomes. So Jason conducts research at the highly politicized scientific interface, the science policy interface, looking at controversies from an STS, or Science and Technology Studies perspective. So issues around scientific dissent, citizen engagement, construction of audiences during scientific controversy, and from what I understand, he'll be talking about some of this work today. And he covers issues from biotech, biofuels, climate, and so forth. The third part, an interesting tidbit about Jason, is that he's been elected chair of the Gordon Research Conference on Science, Technology, and Policy. And this is a great honor, also a great burden, so I wish you well with that, Jason, coming up in 2016. And the last bit is that he has his PhD in the ESPM program, or Environmental Science, Policy, and Management from CU Berkeley, and his first degree is in biology from Stanford, and so that probably has some inner conflicts that maybe you work through as well, that help prepare you for these controversies. So the Stanford-Cal rivalry. So thank you, each of you, for coming, and I'll turn the floor over to you to start.
Can you guys hear me? All right. So I think, like Shally this morning, I should say that I work for the National Renewable Energy Lab, and we are a lab of the Department of Energy, and I'm speaking and giving you my own opinion on things, and not necessarily that of NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and certainly not that of the Department of Energy. I, as Max said, I'm an energy analyst at the Department of Energy, and I spent a year in 2007 and 8 at headquarters, at the Department of Energy headquarters at their wind program, and I got to be a lot closer to the Department of Energy decision-making than I had ever hoped to be, and learned a lot about how things really work in Washington, and some of you have those stories too, but that is a different panel. And my role is a little bit different from my fellow panelists in that I do energy policy research, and I look at, right now, what I'm going to talk about today is my wind power research mostly, and then I go all over the country to speak about the research that I do. And so usually it's a panel like this or a lecture or something like that. So I'm not generally having discussions with stakeholders or discussions with the public that much, although I love to do that. But my role is really to communicate the research that I've done. It's kind of more of a one-way street. But of course we always take questions, but that's different. So I have 3 examples that I'm going to talk about today about communicating science and research when there's kind of a visceral reaction to what you're trying to communicate. And Roger mentioned stem cells, you know, that's kind of those words have kind of been taken over. So one of the things I focus on is jobs, and jobs used to just be a word about employment, and now it's just this really big politicized word that, you know, every time you hear a politician, they always talk about how they're going to create jobs. So anyway, so I'm going to go through 3 examples that sort of situations that I get into, and then I'll try to end each of those with either ways that I've come up with to sort of help me through the predicament of communicating science to people who might not want to hear about the topic at all. And so the first one is a short one, and one of the things that I do is I look at the economic development impacts, including employment, that come from particular electricity generating facilities, and so wind and other. But I was asked to go to Appalachian State and talk about my research. And it was in the larger context it was this governor's energy plan that was being unfolded, and they were talking about clean energy policy and that kind of thing. But I was warned a little bit before I got there, but mostly when I got there, there were kind of talks in the hallway about, you know, don't say coal, don't say air pollution, don't say global warming, don't say climate change, and I don't normally focus on global warming and climate change. Sometimes it comes in depending on what I'm talking about, but we do often talk about the impacts of wind power versus impacts of other electricity sources. And the U.S. Department of Energy, believes that, every source of energy is needed, and that's NREL's position really too. I mean, we are the main lab for energy efficiency and renewable energy, so we focus on those things, but we're not an advocate for any particular type of energy. So I wasn't going in there to be sort of pro wind power, but it was interesting because I did have to change my talk at the last minute and just not mention certain things. And I guess I've been doing this for about 8 years, and one of the things that I've learned is to talk with the people that you're going to talk to before you give your panel talk or your talk, or at least some of them. Try to listen to where they are, where they're coming from. Their whole family has been coal miners, and they're not necessarily anti-wind, but they're anti-coal. And that makes sense. And I didn't really have an anti-coal message, but I did have a clean air message. And I thought that, in a lot of surveys, most people are for clean air and clean water. Well, those, at least the clean air, those words have also been politicized a little bit. And when you say clean air, does that necessarily mean that you're a Democrat and that you, want renewable energy? No, it doesn't. But sometimes it seems that way in the political debates that we hear today, when we hear it on the evening news, that kind of thing. So my solution to this predicament was talk to the locals beforehand, be sensitive to their history and their culture, and also remember that when I'm talking about my work, it's a really small part of the bigger picture. So we're talking about building electricity infrastructure. We're talking about building wind plants, building coal plants, whatever it is. And we probably shouldn't base the decision to build one of those on how many jobs it's going to support or other economic development impacts. I mean, if you need jobs, you shouldn't necessarily put up an electricity plant. You should need the electricity, and the jobs come from that. So that gets twisted around sometimes. But that was my first one. The second example is I work, Max mentioned social acceptance, and so I work on the social acceptance of wind power. And that also is known as public acceptance or community involvement for wind power. And by this I mean involving the local residents and the stakeholders, so the utilities and things like that, before putting up wind turbines. Before you even think about the wind resource in a certain place, talk to the community about what they think about wind and try to educate them a little bit. And then also staying kind of their friend through the construction period and the operations period. And not surprisingly, you probably know this, but studies show that people are more supportive of wind in general, wind power in general, if this occurs. So if the stakeholders are involved from the beginning. And companies know this. They're doing a much better job than they used to on this, at least most of them are. And some of them even write into their contracts that they'll use local components or local labor or something like that, which makes the community happy as well. And so the U.S. in general, through surveys, is overwhelmingly supportive of wind power, but it's also getting politicized. The kind of anti-wind people and pro-wind people use extremes, like we heard about earlier, different extremes, but it's the same kind of thing to make their point. There's something called wind turbine syndrome that has never been statistically proven, but there is a medical doctor saying that there's something called wind turbine syndrome, which is that people get sick from their proximity to wind turbines. So they get more anxious, they are stressed out, they get headaches, they get all sorts of things. This also applies to cows. So they're saying that in some areas cows get sick or cows won't produce milk where there are wind turbines. So this has not been proven, and in peer-reviewed studies they usually say the opposite. But this person is a medical doctor, and so people are definitely listening. And if you have the question of whether a wind farm should go up in your community, and there's somebody saying, well, you could get sick, you could get tremors, you could get all these terrible things, you're going to listen to that too, whether it was peer-reviewed or not. So what's true about that? Well, the people might be getting sick, but there might not be a correlation to the wind turbine. The cows, might be doing something different. There might not be a correlation to the wind turbine. But there are effects from wind turbines. There is something known as the flicker effect. It depends how close you are to the wind turbine. It depends on the angle of the sun and all sorts of things. But if we were sitting right here, if there were a wind turbine right there, it would be, it could be, depending on how close I was, flickering like this, on my face, and that's annoying. And that's the flicker effect, and people get really mad about that. And that's usually when, like I said, you're very, very close to a wind turbine, and most wind turbines are sited more than a mile from homes. So it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. There's also noise from wind turbines. I work about 600 feet away from some wind turbines, and usually I don't hear them at all, but sometimes I do. And the pro-wind, the developers, the pro-wind, wind companies who want to put these plants in, tell people, well, it's about a 45 decibel, the noise is about 45 decibels, which is the same as a casual conversation in another room. That's the volume that you'll hear. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it really does sound for a second like, like an engine or something, a much louder sound. So are they giving are they telling the truth? Is the other side telling the truth? Again, they're both using kind of extremes here. And so how do I tell my story? You have to tell, you have to talk about those things because the extremes are out there. So you have to talk about those things and talk about what's happening in between as well, because what happens normally, is somewhere in between. It might not be, the exact middle point, but it is somewhere in between. People worry about property values, and there have been good studies saying that there's no increase in property values when you have a wind turbine nearby. But you say that to people that we did this research, but they don't believe it, because of course your property value would go down if you have to look at this ugly wind turbine. I mean, that's how some people think. So the science is not going to convince those people. You can tell them again and again, but that's what this panel is about, is how do you communicate the science and try to really get people to understand what you're saying, instead of having just this visceral reaction. There are technology issues. People see the extremes on YouTube. You can see, I think there's a fire on a wind turbine. There's a blade that fell off a wind turbine or something. And so people say, you can't have a wind turbine go up because the blades will fly off and cut your children's heads off. Well, that's never happened. And extreme cases, there are a few examples of extreme cases, but again, those are the extremes. And then we all have heard, I think, about Cape Wind, the wind project offshore, off of Cape Cod. And the people who live in that area are generally really friendly towards wind, but they don't want to see the wind turbines, even though they'd be really, really small off the coast. So what should we do? They don't want to see it. They're the community that lives there, and they don't want to see it. You have to bring everybody together, and it's taken over 10 years to get lots of permits, and we still don't know whether it's going to happen. But it's a really controversial issue. People have been living there for a long time with that same view, that their views are important, to them. And even if they only see them a few weeks out of the year when they're at that home or whatever. So one of the problems that I think here is that the more wind that goes in the ground, the more people are going to be involved, right? Because there's getting less and less space where there's sort of wind going in open spaces. I mean, there's still a lot, but in the future, 20, 30 years out. So I guess the solution that I have here, my own solution, is just to try to talk about the big picture and the overall situation, and maybe bring people in who've had kind of this normal experience, whatever that means, and maybe you can look at county commissioners can talk to other county commissioners. People who live near wind turbines can talk to other people who live near wind turbines. That's the way that I've seen is the most helpful. People can talk to others who are kind of just like them. And so, yeah, so not the extremes. And the third one that I'll talk about, and I don't know how I'm doing the test. Okay, great, perfect. The third one that I'll talk about is jobs, which, I'm used to saying, oh, it's such a hot topic during election year, but it seems like it's always election year. It seems like jobs are always a really hot topic. And all politicians say that they're going to create jobs and that the other guy is going to destroy jobs. It's really difficult to create a job, especially as a politician. That's not really their job to create a job. So that's probably, you know, another panel too, but I always laugh when I hear that they're going to create jobs. And so my specific research is I look at gross jobs from usually one or many electricity generating plants, usually wind. And I don't look at net jobs. I look at gross jobs, and I always try to communicate, you know, what I'm talking about. But the questions come up. So what's a job? Are you counting full-time workers? Are you counting temporary employees? Are you counting, you know, part-time temporary employees? And what is job creation? People say we're going to create jobs. And we don't even use that language in the work that I do. We just say jobs are supported by a specific plant because we're not looking at net jobs. And so to us, job creation is a job that is a new job that enters into the economy. And this could be filled by somebody who's unemployed, or, you know, somebody who wants to work and wasn't working, and not taken from another industry. And you know, it's easy to guess. So jobs estimates can be pretty close when you look at something in the past. Jobs estimates can be pretty close. Job projections are always wrong, you know, like any projection, but it still makes sense to do them. They're just usually not going to be exact. So again, you know, what's true here? You would think that it would be simple to count jobs because you can go into a factory and count the number of people. But if someone, you know, working at General Electric spends 10% of their time on wind energy, does that mean that that person is, you know, has a wind job? And if you want to get into those nuances and count the percentage of time that people are spending on wind work or on other work, good luck getting your research funded, because that will take a really, really long time. We're trying to do a survey right now of the wind workforce, and it's very complicated. So this work was really frustrating to me, and we occasionally got in trouble for projecting jobs or trying to count jobs at NREL. And at one point we were FOIA'd, the Freedom of Information Act, by different people, and that is it is, I don't know if this has happened to any of you, but it takes so much of your time. And I think we had over 1,000 emails that we had to give to this party. And it was pretty amazing, and it's just because jobs was such a hot topic, nothing really ever came of it, but it was incredible. And so I was really frustrated by this process, and I just thought there are other people who do this. There are other people who try to estimate jobs, and we should get together and come up with kind of a standard way of doing it, or standard way of presenting it, or something. So I organized a one-day workshop with the Nicholas Institute for Policy Solutions, and they're at Duke University. And we got together with about 100 people, congressional staff, as well as energy policy experts who focus on jobs. And this was a couple years ago, and we sat down and talked about jobs all day long. There was a guy in there from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it was his job to count green jobs. Okay, can you imagine? Like there were so many definitions of green jobs, and he was like, well, should I count the computer that the person uses? You know, does that make an economic impact? The computer that the person uses who's working on the green job study? You know, does that? So it was just, it went on and on, but it was really confusing. And we came up with some recommendations that are in this policy brief on the Nicholas Institute website. But I mean, to sort of sum them up, we decided that especially when communicating with policymakers and politicians, you want to present a range of jobs instead of, you know, there will be 256 jobs from this, whatever it is. And also use a lot of caveats, you know, say exactly what your assumptions are, and really say, you know, how you did your research. And there are a few more recommendations than that, but I guess that's mainly what I've learned, is that when you're reporting on something like that, you know, really try to tell people, and when they take it and communicate it, use a range, and put your caveats in there. But you know, we can't be responsible for what the client or what the politician does with our numbers, but we can give it to them in the most truthful way that we can. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Becca.
Hi, I just first want to thank Lisa and Max for the invitation. I'm very inspired and impressed by their work, and so it's a really great honor to participate in their panel. As Max indicated, I'm a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology here at the University of Colorado. And my research program is very heavily involved in the evolution of biodiversity. And so as a card-carrying evolutionary biologist, it is my purview to talk about this debate or the controversies related to evolutionary biology. And I'll sort of give you the context in which most of these discussions happen. First of all, I teach not only a class on climate change and film, but I teach the general biology to the majors, and my sections are related to evolution, speciation, and human physiology. And so it's very much a part of my teaching mission to supply information about evolutionary biology, and I'll tell you how I try to garner buy-in from the 700 students in my class. Another way in which I have approached the controversy related to teaching evolution or talking about the controversies related to evolution comes into play when I participate in workshops for science teachers within Boulder County who bring concerns and questions about integrating evolution within their classroom, how to approach discussions about evolution that, again, will garner buy-in from their students. Let me just define what the controversy is characterized as. I'll define sort of the major talking points of two ends of the controversy, although there are many different complex layers. And then I'll address sort of two parts of the controversy that I address head-on in my introductory biology class, again, to an audience of 700 freshmen. And so I would characterize the controversy surrounding evolutionary biology as one that is kind of captured as a controversy between science and religion at its core. Really, what is up for debate within this controversy is notions or an understanding of how life on Earth began and patterns thereof. And so evolutionary biologists would take a very unifying take on this debate by simply admitting that a definition of evolution is not controversial at all. We have a lot of data suggesting that embracing a simple definition of Darwinian evolution, which is simply changes in populations over time that are heritable. A more modern definition would be changes in the genetic makeup of populations over time. We would indicate that there's absolutely nothing controversial about that. I think we would also readily admit that the controversy sort of enters in when we start discussing about how it is that evolution happens. And as I teach this course on climate change and film, I think it's slightly analogous to the issue of, is climate change happening? That doesn't really seem to be all that controversial, but the controversy seems to really be quite vibrant, at least among the students I interact with, when we start asking questions about, well, have humans accelerated the pace of climate change? What are the underlying causes? So I think there's some very interesting analogies there. The general public, when polled very recently, would indicate, and I'll read you the statement, that 46% of the general public would indicate that God created humans in their present form at one time within the last 10,000 years. So those are two very different ends of a spectrum, if you will, wherein evolutionary biologists have complete buy-in as to a naturalistic definition of how the origin of life on our planet happened via evolution. Whereas we know that it's a very controversial issue when placed in front of the general public. About half of people polled would indicate that they don't either believe or think that there's any solid evidence for patterns of evolutionary change. Before I start talking about how I deal with the issue, I want to just indicate that this has been a debate that has been ongoing for 100 or more years, especially at the time that Darwin published his famous book, The Origin of Species. And the debate is still really alive and well. So we'll often hear about different states debating whether or not textbooks related to biology should have statements on the front caveats about whether evolution has been proven or is a fact. And last month in Missouri, Missouri voters unanimously approved an amendment. It was called the Right to Pray Amendment, which basically begins by declaring that all residents of the state of Missouri have a natural and indefensible right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own consciousness. And it also indicates that, in another clause, again unanimously passed in a recent election, that no student shall be compelled to perform or to participate in academic assignments or educational presentations that violate his or her religious beliefs. There, again, the debate seems to be distilled as one between religion, your faith and understanding of how the world was created, and one related to scientific tests about mechanisms related to the origin of life on our planet Earth. So I want to talk about sort of two ways in which both parties talk about this debate. The first is what constitutes good science education, and whether creationism or intelligent design or other faith-based indications of how life on Earth formed should enter into the picture in a science classroom. And the second thing that I want to address is definitions of science, which I think very much tie into whether or not faith-based or belief-based definitions or explanations for the origin of Earth should be taught side by side with more scientific hypotheses. I want to just sort of situate you. Imagine that you are one of my 700 students at the start of the term. You're a freshman. You're new to campus. You're sorting out your place in the world. And I already know, based on large public polls, that about half of my students immediately will not be impressed by my introductions of evolution. So when I introduce myself to my classroom, yes, I'm an evolutionary biologist, this is what I study. This is the thread that underlies all of biology. That is how I first sell the topic of evolution. You know, everything within biology makes sense only in the light of evolution. That is a very important and popular phrase that evolutionary biologists firmly, I don't want to use the term believe, but we firmly adhere to. And so imagine that I already know that half of my students might feel a bit attacked. There's really nothing more political or perhaps frightening for a young student away from home for the first time than to hear in their class, well, gosh, what I think I'm hearing is that everything I've currently thought about the way the world forms or how I should behave in the world is completely wrong. So I actually spend an entire lecture period, and I lecture for 75 minutes, talking about this controversy and why, after this first lecture, I'm no longer going to talk about faith-based, non-scientific explanations of patterns of biodiversity on our planet or the origin of life on our planet. And I'll tell you some mistakes I've made, and I'll tell you some things that I think have increased some buy-in over the years. The big mistake is coming in, nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution, QED, moving on, whatever you believe, we're not talking about. That does not work, especially because I have 15 more weeks with these students, and every single lecture is going to be referring back to evolutionary mechanisms. That is just a killer. That is not the way to start out the term. What I do is spend a lot of time talking about differences between ways of knowing and understanding patterns of diversity or the origin of life on our planet. And I do so by first sort of explaining my own personal position as an evolutionary biologist and someone who grew up within a very religious household. Give them sort of a personal anecdote of how I've sort of resolved some of the complexity. I think that sort of brings them into a position of, I can relate to this. She's not really crazy or fundamentalist in her views. She's thought about these things, and I even remind them that, yes, as a freshman in biology, I was really confronted with the same thing I am confronting you with at this very moment. But I also talk a little bit about the philosophy of science and how we approach understanding our natural world by testing hypotheses and falsifying them by collecting data, generating new hypotheses, applying experiments, and so on. And I talked to them about the fact that that is one way, that is a scientific way in which we can apply the scientific method to better understand patterns of diversity, patterns of evolutionary change, the origin of life on Earth. On the other hand, I just bring right into the fold that there are not even one. The intelligent design movement might have students believe that there's only one alternative to evolution, but in fact, there's hundreds. Many other cultures have embraced a non-Christian definition or belief system on the origin of life on our planet, and so it would be presumptuous just to, for example, bring in one particular definition based on maybe something they've heard in the news or that has been most popularized in the news. So I bring in several different sort of origin stories that they may or may not have heard about, just to indicate there is a wealth of diversity of the way that different cultures and people think about the origin of life on our planet. Thanks, Max. I also talked to them about the fact that religion is a very different way of knowing and understanding our world, and that these other ways of knowing don't have to be subject to hypothesis testing or experimentation. In fact, there are many ways in which there are limitations to applying a scientific method. And as such, they are fundamentally different ways of understanding our world. But rather than offer them as mutually exclusive ways, you either adopt this or you adopt that way, I indicate to them that there are some really great ways that those views can be complementary. So for example, there's a theistic sort of movement within evolutionary biology which would argue, yes, we accept evolution as a mechanism by which planet Earth formed and diversification happened, but we cannot falsify a notion that that has not been generated by some deity. That gives my students a lot of comfort to say, oh, okay, it's not an either or an or scenario. And so we're very, we sort of explore that through a little bit of discussion as well. The other thing that I indicate is that understanding our world via science and understanding our world via religion or other faith-based or belief systems are also fundamentally different in ways like science does not at all suggest ways or moral codes, ways that in which you should behave in a social setting. So one way in which evolution is often attacked, and I will tell you that my department and many of the faculty have received several messages, and we even have our own little stalker, to indicate that, wow, we are really poisoning our youth. If we're teaching students the survival of the fittest is the way the world works, we're basically giving them this moral code to go out and do whatever it is that they want to do. So the latest shooting event in Aurora was actually blamed on the fact that maybe the student had encountered a lot of evolutionary training in his background. We have our own personal stalker, like I said. The debate is very much alive. On the other hand, I basically want to dismiss this idea that evolution or understanding the mechanisms underlying evolution tell us anything about the way humans should behave. There's absolutely nothing about science that indicates how you should treat your neighbor, your parents, etc. On the other hand, faith-based religions, or whatever groups that my students identify with, might be a way in which you find your moral compass. Science does not at all do that. So those are, again, two very different ways of understanding and knowing our world. I also just indicate that I'm giving you guys 75 minutes to ask questions, and I'll give you my viewpoint about this debate, but that I firmly believe that although the debate is timely, in some ways it's very political, it's pressing, it's relevant, it is better taught in a very different type of class. Although classes like that are not very often taught because they garner a lot of trouble. So I guess just to summarize, the way that I buy in is to try to find points of relation with my students, to try to not exclude the fact that there are different ways of understanding our world and that we can find complementarity rather than me offering some sort of definition that indicates that they should either be pro-evolution and anti-religion or vice versa. And I think that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Becca. Jason.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa and Max, for inviting me. So I come at this from a little bit of a different perspective. Hearing the first two panelists, my reaction is, ooh, I want to study them. Because what I'll talk about today is mostly about the research that I've done on public engagement exercises. Although, as you'll see, I'm also a bit of a practitioner. To research these kinds of things, you have to make them happen because they don't happen as much on their own, at least in our culture. So the goals that are served by these kinds of exercises of the kind of public engagement on scientific issues, one goal is the public understanding of science, although I would certainly reject the deficit model that says the way forward is just to make sure that we download information to citizens who don't know anything. A second goal is something around the ideas around democratizing science or democratizing the governance of technology. A third is an interest in the deliberative process. A focus on deliberation seeks wisdom from high-quality dialogue that we attempt to create within a layperson group. And the last goal is something around, you may have heard the term upstream engagement, which suggests that we might want to consider governance of science and technology before the problems emerge. Can we do anything like anticipatory governance or upstream engagement with lay people? So today what I'd like to do is to discuss three different variations of these engagement processes. The first is to talk about the most well-known group that's done this, the Danish Board of Technology and their consensus conferences. How many people are aware of the Danish Board? Okay, so quite a few, so I'll be brief there. The second is the National Citizens Technology Forum, which happened in 2008, and I'll describe that a little bit later. And the third is Worldwide Views on Global Warming, which occurred in 2009. And each of these kinds of exercises happen at different scales. And the other thing that's relevant for this panel is that they place experts in different positions with respect to the lay people involved. And that's where I want to really focus my talk today, is thinking about where do we put expertise when we engage citizens on issues of science and technology. So first I'll briefly cover consensus conferences. The Danish Board of Technology is in a unique institutional position. It wasn't a government agency exactly, but most of its funding came from the government. They were essentially assigned to do citizen engagement exercises on issues that were politically relevant to the parliament. They would organize citizen panels of around 15 participants drawn from around Denmark and organize facilitated discussions over multiple weekends with these lay people to generate reports on reports of policy recommendations to decision makers. And these reports were taken seriously by policymakers. They didn't translate neatly into policy, but they were significant. Thinking about these exercises, where did the expertise lie? The first place that you find expertise is in the background materials. The Danish board spent a lot of time with a steering committee thinking about what sort of technical background materials were important for citizens to know about before they came to deliberate on these subjects. So expertise was contained within these background reports. Second, there was direct interaction with between these panels and experts that were relevant to the topic. So experts would come and present to the panelists about their field of expertise and how that impacted the policy question. And very interestingly, there was cross-examination of the experts by the citizen panel. So the citizens are allowed to they don't just hear from the experts what their viewpoint is, but then they can challenge the experts and put them in conversation with each other, which I think is a quite rich way to engage expertise. And importantly, in this model, the experts were excused for the weekend of deliberation over the policy recommendations. They were not included in that part of the conversation. They did have a last look at the report for factual errors, but their preferences, their values, their opinions were not supposed to be a substantial part of the recommendations report. And so here, I think what we see is expertise in the service of what we might call informed deliberation. I'll just mention that there's, in these consensus conferences organized by the Danish board, there's a high emphasis on recruiting so-called ordinary citizens. So anyone with expertise or a stake in the policy issue was not allowed to serve on the panel. And this is justified in thinking about avoiding the kind of power dynamics that emerge in conversations when experts give their opinion, and with their credibility then dominate the discussion. Other folks' research has shown that these result in very high quality deliberations. The citizens learn a great deal. They can engage with highly technical issues. They ask different kinds of questions than experts would ask, and they bring new perspectives to the issues. The second exercise I'll talk about is one that I have direct experience with, which is the National Citizens Technology Forum. This was in March of 2008. It was organized as a kind of response to, well, how can we do a consensus conference in the context of a large nation like the United States, where there's so much diversity, where there's the geography just would make it difficult to bring just 15 people together. And so this exercise was a kind of an experiment of having a multi-sided consensus conference at 5 different universities with an online component where all of the participants across the country would communicate. So there were the small panels, just as the consensus conference model does. I was the lead facilitator at the University of Wisconsin-Madison site. And there were introductory weekends that were on site, face-to-face we called them, then online deliberations, which are called K to K, keyboard to keyboard, and then final weekends, face-to-face weekends to generate reports. Here, in thinking about this panel, the expertise again was contained in the background materials. So the organizers of the NCTF had a steering committee and worked to put together background materials. The topic was nanotechnology and human enhancement, so kind of mostly a futuristic-oriented topic. There was also online engagement with experts in a serial manner. So citizens deliberated online for a couple of weeks developing questions for the experts, and then the experts appeared in this chat room for a specified time to engage with the citizens, and that's how the experts appeared. There was the same commitment to recruiting so-called ordinary citizens to keep expertise kind of siloed in the process. So in that sense, it was similar to the consensus conferences. And what I want to do now is I want to share with you some of our research findings, and this reflects work by me and my team at Madison, and some folks at Colorado School of Mines as well. First of all, participants challenged the balance and usefulness of the background materials. So this was a key place where expertise was supposed to be contained. And yet participants argued about whether the background materials were relevant and what sort of expertise was contained in those background materials. For example, the background materials had very futuristic scenarios about super eyes and what they might allow us to do. But there was no data on what nanotechnologies are currently out there and what do we know about their health and environmental effects. Participants raised this as in the first weekend of discussion, saying where is this expertise? Second, participants wanted much more control regarding which experts they would interface with. So they said, these are the kinds of questions we are concerned about. We want to talk with an expert that knows something about this. Unfortunately, the organizers of this, and this is at a different level than my organizer status, so I didn't have control over this, they chose the experts in advance. And so the expertise that was brought into this engagement exercise was predetermined. Third, and let me just pause for a second and note that there's 2 kinds of expertise in these citizen engagement exercises. One is the kind of technical expertise that we're used to talking about, and the second is the expertise of organizing these things and pulling them off, or expertise that's demonstrated by facilitators, by event organizers. So the next finding I want to share is that participants resisted the control of the online moderators in this conference. And that's a kind of process expertise that was present. For example, many citizen participants kept bringing up, well, what are the health and environmental effects of nanotechnology? And time again, the online moderators ruled that as out of bounds. They used their expert status to say, this is outside the bounds of this deliberation. We will not pursue those questions. And citizens complained over and over about this. Third, there was very little limited time for engagement with the experts, and it was all online. And this meant that participants couldn't read body language. One of the things that occurred to me is that an important interaction between lay people and experts is the development of trust. And when everything is in a chat environment and there's not the personal contact, that kind of trust doesn't build up. Next is that participants also sought outside sources of expertise that were well outside the control of the organizers of this meeting. So because it happened over a period of 3 to 4 weeks, citizen participants were doing lots of research on their own, mostly online, and finding other sources of expertise that were well outside of our control. And we actually studied how they did that and how that may have made an impact. And lastly, I'll just mention that this dichotomy between expert and lay people is problematic when you put it into practice. When we reviewed who the citizens were, there was a lot of expertise in the room. We had a retired engineer. We had a reporter who had done multiple stories about nanotechnology, who was a lay, ordinary citizen in the room. So that boundary becomes problematic. Lastly, I'll tell you a bit about the Worldwide Views on Global Warming project, which was run by the Danish Board of Technology to scale up their consensus conference idea to an international scope. How do we engage with global issues with this kind of model of engagement? There were sites around the world in 38 countries of around 100 people who were then split into tables of 8 to 10 people for deliberation. Rather than generating a report, these different sites allowed deliberation, so discussion among the citizens, and then citizens would vote on their policy preferences, predetermined choices around certain issues. And then all of those results were compiled together to give a kind of worldwide view on global warming. And this was several months prior to the COP15 meetings in Copenhagen. So where was the expertise here? There was expertise brought into the production of videos because this was an international event where we couldn't assume literacy. Videos were produced to be accessible to all people, and they were translated into different languages. And the sort of baseline for expertise was an assumption that if we reflected the consensus of the IPCC's fourth assessment, that would be the baseline. That was the assumption where the expertise would lie. And obviously the videos were very one way. There was no dialogue with experts during this engagement exercise, and the facilitators at the tables were not only chosen because they didn't have expertise in this topic, but they were told, you're not to bring any of your technical expertise to this discussion. You're to be facilitators. So what were some of our research findings studying this process? First of all, that the question of representation is quite key. So who is in the room, and are they representative of ordinary citizens, of lay people? We, time and time again, faced the accusation that the room was just full of a bunch of greens. And so whatever preferences came out of this exercise were irrelevant to policymakers. However, an interesting response by someone at the Danish Board of Technology, he said, yes, but in America, you just count you count the votes of the people who voted, right? You count the votes of people who showed up. And so his contention was, if these kinds of engagement exercises are open to everyone, then those who show up get to have their voices heard. It's an interesting response. Second, we face the question of whether this is anything more than something like an informed public opinion poll. Is this engagement accomplishing anything more than asking these opinions or preferences of citizens after we give them a little bit of information? And perhaps, though, this is what our media understand. The only significant media attention we got in the U.S. around this Worldwide Views project was when we framed this event as an informed public opinion poll. Another finding that might be very obvious is that translating engagement into policy is incredibly difficult. Our U.S. team was operating within a model of what we called policy pathways, thinking about how do we move these preferences to decision makers for them to consider. And that turned out to be quite naive and not very productive. And so one of the things that one of the conclusions we came to is that if these kinds of citizen engagement exercises are going to be meaningful in a political sense, there needs to be a connection to an ongoing network, an ongoing policy network. And actually, I don't have a lot of knowledge about this, but some of the people who participated in Worldwide Views in the US started a new network called the Expert and Citizen Assessment of Science and Technology, or ECAS network. And what they're attempting to do is to create an ongoing institutional embodiment of the effort to engage citizens with these highly technical issues and connect them to the policymaking process. And I'll end there, and I'll just mention that I've included right at the foot of the stage some reprints of an article that we published about the National Citizens Technology Forum, and just a one-page reference list of things that I've published on these exercises if you're interested in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you. Great, so now the chance to, I think, do you want to just open it up right away for questions rather than, yeah, so let's go ahead and we'll just take questions from the audience. I think from this time, we're going to actually do the roving mic so that you guys get to, oh. It does still work. All right. So just open up for questions. We got a good half hour here to
Okay. Jason, this question's for you, and it has to do with problem framing, because we know that many of these policy decisions starts with framing the problem. And so I'm curious to learn about the role of the experts in framing the problems that the citizens were invited to participate in, and how aware were the experts about the sort of the political process of problem framing in your experiments, and I'll call these experiments. How aware of problem framing were the researchers, and was the problem framing done intentionally, or were the experts allowed to do it? I just want to learn a little bit more about that front-end process.
Sure, thanks, that's a good question. So I assume that so there's, as I said, there's different kinds of expertise happening here. Experts on climate science.
Excuse me, just being asked for you all to use the microphones as well. So.
It's not on.
This one's on.
Can we get them all around me? I feel like I'm at the UN.
Press conference.
Can you hear me? Okay. So what I began to say was that there's multiple kinds of expertise involved in these. Certainly, for example, in the Worldwide Views on Global Warming, experts on climate science were not involved in framing the questions for this deliberation. In that case, and in other cases of the Danish Board Technology consensus conferences, I believe that the questions were framed by policymakers. And in the case of Worldwide Views on Global Warming, what the Danish Board of Technology attempted to do was to look at what are the policy questions up for debate at COP15, and to use those as ways to frame the questions that citizens would deliberate over during the consensus conference in order to make the deliberation meaningful to a policy negotiation. In the case of the National Citizens Technology Forum, I don't know how the questions were formed. I think it's not a coincidence that there was a focus on nanotechnology and that it was run through a center focusing on nanotechnology in society. And so, as many of you know, there was an explosion of research in social sciences around nanotechnology, just as there were in the physical sciences, because there were funds available. I was not particularly fond of the framing of the questions in the NCTF in terms of the framing of the project, because I certainly was sympathetic to the citizen participants who said, well, what is this really about, and aren't there other kinds of concerns that we need to consider here? And the higher organizers were bounding the conversation in pretty strict ways, and that was problematic.
Anyone respond to what I think might be a general, you tell me if it's not a general issue that you run in, and I run into it in class, when the discussion, even if there is an expertise body available to the students or to the discussants in a panel, someone comes in with this outside package of material, like for instance, the eye has irreducible complexity, or jobs are created by um, taxing less, taxing job creators less or something. So there's actually, and they engage very technically, but they're not the experts. So when the lay participants bring technical arguments, it happens in global warming all the time, but in all these others, just comment on, maybe Rebecca, start by what happens when that happens in class? What do you do?
Right, so the question, I think, is addressing the idea that many of the counter arguments to teaching evolution or to including other sort of discussions of other ways in which our planet has come to be in patterns of biodiversity. Well, there are many. I will just talk about one. So the intelligent design movement has tried to edge its way into the classroom by, exactly as you mentioned, bringing to bear things that just you could not imagine evolving over slow periods of time. And our counter to that would certainly be with their testable hypotheses with which we can collect data. And the argument that you are putting forth is one that doesn't require a testable hypothesis. And so your belief system might enable you to embrace your particular definition of the origin of life on Earth or how it's changing. But in the domain of science, we are talking about ways in which we can collect hypotheses and put them through the tests of the scientific method. And we're not asking you to put any faith or beliefs into play here. We're asking about testing hypotheses, putting forward ideas about how you could collect data to falsify or support a particular explanation. Does that address your question?
Not doing. I'm bringing you a falsifiable hypothesis, so you got to talk me out of it. That the eye has this irreducible complexity.
I would say that that is certainly not the case, and that there are lots of physiological structures that we have demonstrated via transitional fossils in the fossil record, all over the place, the eye being just one example of dozens, and if not hundreds.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that too, just as a fun anecdote. So in the Worldwide Views on Global Warming project, the framing of this discussion was not a debate over whether climate change was real or whether it was anthropogenically caused. Those were taken as assumptions. And yet, at the Colorado Mines site, where I was the head facilitator, I had a table facilitator run up to me in a panic, and she was white and sweating. And she said, someone at my table brought 8-page packets about why global warming isn't real. What do I do? So this is exactly what you're raising, is what happens when a form of expertise arises out of the layperson. How do you deal with that? I made the call just because I had to make a decision. I went over to the table and I said, so I understand that you've brought some materials to share with your table mates. I said, we all bring, every person in this room brings a kind of expertise and a kind of knowledge into the room, and yours is welcome too. But yours is not welcome to dominate the discussion. And so your facilitator will make sure that you have a time to speak and to share, but not at the expense of other people sharing their views. And apparently that worked very well. And that individual actually came up to me after the event and just thanked me for what a wonderful experience this was and how much he appreciated being a part of it. And there wasn't a particular animosity at the table. So that's a very tricky moment. And I think I actually wrote down a question hearing my co-panelists talk. Who gets to decide when controversy exists? So in your case, does win syndrome, do we dismiss that out of hand? Or do we let a citizen's concern or anecdote or intuition drive the scientific community to investigate a particular question? Or in your case, do we let the controversy around evolution be a controversy within evolutionary science? And what are the kind of risks that we engage with as an expert community when we allow those kinds of concerns to drive questions in our fields.
I have a quick comment. This is more towards Becca's position or discussion. I taught a class at the University of Utah, a climate change class, and I used this similar techniques about science and religion because it was really important in that class. And I found it very helpful, and I think the students appreciated that. So I spent a lecture, it wasn't 75 minutes, it was 45 minutes, but we talked a lot about that issue. I also had students in my class who I knew were working for legislators who were fighting against climate change that were taking my class. So it was very interesting, just the group and understanding who's in your class and what are some of the barriers to their learning. So thank you for sharing that. It was nice to hear someone else did the same thing.
Yeah, I say that only after having made some very big mistakes and having lots of teary-eyed students and letters from parents after my first year here. But no, I think if they get a sense of we're all in the same boat, this controversy is very popular, it's very real. Make no mistake, I am not at all attacking your belief systems. Let's just have an open discussion and move on. You know, we're not going to elaborate on it through the rest of the term, so questions about irreducible complexity that is not a testable hypothesis. It does not belong in a discussion within a science classroom. And I feel that I do garner more buy-in when, after I've had that discussion, I can talk about evolution quite freely throughout the rest of the term.
Yeah, great panel. Rebecca, this question's for you. Maybe you could take a step back. And I guess the question I have is why is this a controversy on a university campus? Because people go to college, that's a choice. They enroll in classes, that's a choice. If I show up in political science department and take a class on Marxism, and I say Marxism is an affront to my values, you know, what you would say is, well, maybe go take a different class. So I guess can you take a step back and we'll say why this is controversial as you see it, and whether we at CU should, why don't we just offer a course, Controversies in Science and Technology, and you can say to those students, if you want to debate that, go over to Max Boykoff's class and you talk about this every day.
Great idea for Max to teach this. No, I totally agree, and I would say that in my first year of teaching evolution within a general audience, we have evolutionary biology students. After 10% of my 700 students, the majority of them are pre-med or psychology students, and the majority don't want to be there. But why even talk about it? Because it is so fundamental to understanding biology that I feel I need to address any preconceived notions about what it is. It is also such a politicized issue. If I don't address it and I don't address the misconceptions about it, I find those really getting in the way of true learning and understanding. And I find that students are very turned off and really get sick of, she's talking about evolution again. I mean, if we've had this discussion and I lay out to them exactly why we're having this discussion and why we will no longer have this discussion, I give them time to also explore what I think is a really interesting current social controversy. And in some ways, I think it's important for them to sort it out themselves. So I feel like it's worth that 75 minutes. Maybe it doesn't belong. I mean, we have argued back and forth, but it is actually within the newer versions of the introductory biology textbooks. This controversy is basically sort of framed from the outset because there is so much controversy and worry and fear among our students. I'm learning about evolution. This is sacrilegious. I'm going to go to hell, etc. Yeah.
I actually want to ask a question too, since I have the microphone. And then I'll turn it over to the next folks. I want to take actually a step to the side and ask you about, Jason, your comment about public polling got me thinking some more. Maybe it's a two-level question. One, to what extent do you think public polling helps to make sense of these controversies that you're talking about in each of your cases? And two, how do you find mass media are treating the nuances and texture of these cases that you're dealing with?
Do you mean how mass media is treating citizen deliberations, or do you mean the topics themselves?
How about citizen deliberations, and then as they relate to the characterization, I think in your case in particular, about it as a public polling exercise, or is that the term that you used for the third of three?
Yeah, like one framing
that's
of
what
these
garnered
kinds of
media
engagements is an
coverage.
informed public opinion poll.
Right.
You know, I would guess, like a lot of you in the room, when you hear polling data about these kinds of issues, it's always a little unsettling. You know, taking survey methodology aside, you know, calling people right before they're cooking dinner and asking them to weigh in on these very complicated questions with yeses or nos or numbers seems to be a strange way to figure out what are the values that the public holds. My experience as a facilitator of these exercises is that when people are given the chance to talk, they have incredibly meaningful and deep discussions, and they clear up misconceptions, and they explore values, and their conversation comes from multiple perspectives. And so, you know, I just love this, that, you know, at the Madison conference we had an unemployed guy with a shaggy beard and a sort of an earring thing through his nose and bones in his ears and tattoos, talking to this little woman who looked like a librarian. And they were having this amazing conversation about nanotechnology. And that doesn't happen when you do public opinion polling. And so to me, there is something valuable about creating a space for discussion and ascertaining the public's view on these kinds of issues when they've had a chance to deliberate. In terms of media coverage, thus far, these kinds of exercises are fairly rare. There's some interesting models that are coming out that I don't know a ton about, but Democracy Speaks, I think, is one. There are efforts to do this, but they are not getting a ton of media attention. I think that, you know, in the US, and you know this better than I do, we're so comfortable with the idea of a public opinion poll. It takes on a kind of scientific veneer of sampling public opinion, that it's very comfortable for the media to report those results. It's very easy to do. We have a methodology. We have companies who know how to do it. This kind of citizen engagement exercise is hard to explain. It's expensive. There's not many people who know how to do it, and the results can't be reported easily in a story. So in some sense, we actually wrote a paper with my colleague Jen Schneider about seeking media attention for worldwide views on global warming. And we realized, of course, that these are not events that are very media friendly. You know, oh yes, come and watch a bunch of citizens discuss calmly about a very politicized issue. Put that on the news, right? It's not exciting, and so it's not very mediagenic, we said. So I think there is a problem there between the kind of the intellectual value of this kind of citizen engagement versus a public opinion poll, and yet the friendliness to quick understanding and mediagenicity.
Can I respond to the media question as well? So I'm kind of sitting here wishing that I had the time, you know, to talk to people and have them be able to talk to me, have these discussions. And usually what happens is we get requests from Congress or from the White House or from somewhere saying we need this, you know, in the next hour. Can you please project jobs estimates for this or that or the other thing? One of the ways that we can get in trouble for this is because this is a really media-friendly question, and it happens like that, and then whatever the politician does with it or doesn't do with it, you know, you can't control. And one of the examples or I should say, one of the things that I have been through is that a colleague and I responded to a jobs prediction that was done by somebody else, and this was seen unfavorably by somebody in the Senate who decided that they would investigate what our methods basically and how we came up with our own response. And it turned out that we had talked to the wind industry about the wind industry. And so that was very bad because if you are asking about wind industry jobs, you shouldn't ask the wind industry. I'm not sure, you know, how else you would get information about the wind industry, but we did talk to the wind industry, and the kind of headlines in these blogs were Obama is in bed with the wind industry. And so we kind of are experiencing this trickle-up effect where something that we do, because it's a national lab and it's part of the Department of Energy, you know, kind of trickles up, and then it's the administration who, and of course, I mean, Obama has no idea that we're doing this study and has no, you know, I'm sure this happens all the time too in administration, but it would be great to have the time to just sit down and talk with that senator or the senator staffer or whoever it was. But we run into this, like, we are, you know, these are kind of sexy words, and we really have to make sure that, you know, we use all the caveats we can. But even then, I mean, now we're kind of, you know, we're much more worried about talking with industry, and we really need to talk to industry because we need their data. So it causes a big predicament for us, you know, and getting people to understand that is really hard. And, you know, we don't even have the time to explain to people that we need to talk to the wind industry. So anyway, that's just kind of an extra aside, but that's something that, you know, you were talking about, you know, these long conversations where people actually learn something, and I guess I'm talking about the opposite, and these very short conversations or short sound bites where people aren't actually learning the science. So.
This is, I guess, mainly to Jason. This notion of bounding the questions. We have an esteemed scientific colleague who often says, that's not the right question to ask. And I can tell you, to scientists, that sets us off. That's probably not the right statement to make. So I would think that the questions themselves would seem to be of great interest. In fact, they'd be an essential part of the learning process that would go on in a meeting like this. In fact, I can imagine that the questions themselves might be more informative than the answers, both from the point of view of frankly, of those even doing science, but also for those doing policy. So I'd like your reaction.
Sure. I think the tension there, I think, is between giving control over to the citizen panel, for example, in framing the questions, which sort of feels the best, and it seems like, you know, we might get the newest perspectives or the most unusual perspectives, having a non-expert body engage with this issue. Let them frame the questions, let them develop the report, let them choose what's important. And the tension between that desire and the desire to be politically relevant. So if the decision-making process is in process and there's, you know, legislation to be voted on, then those are the questions that matter the most in terms of the immediate policy goals. And so if you want to organize these citizen deliberation exercises as an input to the policy process, then the framing of the question, there has to be some balance with the framing of the question. If you're aiming for a much more kind of upstream engagement, perhaps, where, you know, we don't yet know, for example, the National Citizens Technology Forum, to be even more specific, the topic was how the intersection of nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive science would affect human enhancement technologies in the future. Okay, wow, that's why I didn't say it earlier. But that's what the citizens were asked to engage with. And their report could be fairly wide-reaching. The questions weren't framed for them. They were asked to comment on how we might manage these emerging technologies. And in that case, you know, we don't have any yet, and so there isn't a specific policy question for them to weigh in upon. And so it seems quite appropriate for the citizens to control the kinds of questions they want to respond to. For Worldwide Views on Global Warming, the intent, though it didn't work out very well, was to have some influence on the COP15 negotiations where particular questions were at play. And so in that case, the organizers felt that it was proper for them to frame the precise questions that the citizens would vote on. But I guess I could see a reasonable spectrum of responses.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly see an efficiency argument, but it also could suggest that the policy was misframed around questions different than those that were of concern to the citizens themselves.
Excellent point.
I'm going to ask another question. All right, so Jason, let me give you a caricature of citizen engagement exercises. These are exercises that are put together by experts using their expertise to exploit citizens who don't care, haven't thought about, have other concerns about these topics, so that they can accentuate their position in the political process as experts. So take COP15. COP15 was a process that was designed by experts based on economics, climate change, and so on. And then you have a group of people from the same class of experts framing the questions that, they say, well, we have to mirror COP15, but they're the same people who designed COP15. And I mean, how would you react to that sort of a critique of these exercises? I mean, we have a process of citizen engagement. It's called governance. And what these experts are trying to do is just work around that, or trying to get a shortcut to influence by exploiting these naive citizens. That's not fair, but it's a caricature of a critique that I think you might hear.
Sure, no, and we do hear that. Because, as I said, the issue of representation was key. That was the sort of our Achilles heel. That was the easiest way to attack this as an advocacy event rather than as, you know, an experiment or a kind of engagement exercise. And I think these exercises are vulnerable to that critique because someone has to choose the citizens, someone has to frame the discussion, someone has to facilitate. What I will say, and this is just personal experience, was that when being part of this international network of people organizing the worldwide views on global warming deliberations, many of us had this little worry, well, what happens if the citizens don't actually care about climate change? What if their votes say that this is not a priority? What if they say, you know, things that are very against the way that many of us view the climate change debates? And, you know, maybe this might not reassure the general public, but my uncertainty would say something about the way that the process was open to different kinds of opinions. You know, that's one response in terms of if I guess it's a true risk to organize a deliberation where you're not sure what the results will be. And yet that's the challenge to be filled in some way. And it's the same kind of challenge that pollsters face, right? When they have to figure out a survey methodology where opinions cannot be predetermined because of the order of the questions or the phrasing of the question. And so the reason I describe these as experiments is that we're still learning how to do this well. We're still learning how to facilitate a process where we can be open to perspectives that we might not have thought of, where people can engage with different kinds of expertise and come up with conclusions and opinions that are informed but not predetermined. And that's just, it's very hard to do.
So I'd like to, it's almost a few minutes to load, and I know Becca has to go up and teach in this, probably this class or a different one, but final last words just from each of the panelists. So you want to just go first so you can hop on?
I think my final last word was, if you're trying to garner buy-in, try to find points in which you can relate with those that you want to buy into whatever it is that you're trying to discuss in a very open manner.
I guess I'll close by saying, while many of my research results are very negative on these kinds of engagement exercises, there is a kind of hope that I've experienced by going through these. We often, you know, hear a statistic like 46% of Americans don't believe in evolution, and whatever percentage don't believe in climate change, and on, and we want to dismiss lay people because wouldn't it just be better if we could be in charge? And I hear that from my students at Colorado School of Mines all the time. And I just want to challenge that notion that I think if you create engagement processes that respect people's intelligence and give them access to information and a chance to deliberate, which I think is a different source of wisdom than this kind of standard expertise that we talk about, that there is hope for making good decisions and finding new perspectives.
And I'll close with something similar, which is I think we heard that that one of the ways that we all deal with this predicament is trust. You know, that people need to trust each other and trust you as the expert, and you need to trust your audience as well. I'm not sure how applicable that is in my work with the sound bites, but I wish it were more applicable. So in my discussions, it is. And then I want to say happy anniversary to the center. And I remember being there at the very beginning of the center when it was a really small group of people, really dedicated. So congratulations for reaching this. And thanks for having me here.
Well, thanks to you all. And with that, I'll close the panel. Let's give our speakers a hand.